Good morning, nice to see you all. I hope you're staying safe and well. In today's video tutorial and in the next few in this series, we are going to be considering Jekyll and Hyde chapter 1, which is the story of the door. So we're going to be looking at this chapter in different parts. I'll be uploading hopefully two videos a day as the week goes on, and we'll be looking at how this novel is set up in the opening chapter, which is typically known in literature as the exposition. We'll talk about how the chapter is framed, which characters are introduced to the reader, where the novel is set, and what plot devices Stevenson uses in this early chapter. And I'll be dividing it into the following parts. So firstly, we'll be talking about Mr Utterson, who's arguably the protagonist of the story, and we'll be talking about male friendships. We'll be talking about London and the setting of the novel. We'll be talking about the theme of duality, which is introduced in various ways in this chapter. Specifically with the image of Jekyll's back door that Hyde has easy access to. We'll be talking about the use of allegories throughout the novel. This is an allegorical novel. This is a novel that has a deeper hidden meaning beneath the surface, and we'll be talking about that in today's lesson. We'll be talking about Hyde's face and the theme of blackmail, which is important for a first-time Victorian reader. I'm going to spoil the novel for you. So if you're watching and you don't want to know what happens, then skip the next part. But I am going to spoil the novel for you because I think it's so important to say from the get-go that Jekyll and Hyde are one and the same. They are the same person. I've had too many experiences teaching this novel in the past where students think that this is Jekyll and this is Hyde and they're two separate people, and Jekyll's good and Hyde is bad. They are inextricably linked. So Jekyll and Hyde are like this. They are bound together in one body, and the point of Jekyll's experiment is to separate the two. So they're bound together, Jekyll and Hyde, good and evil. Jekyll performs the experiment, which allows him to separate these two sides of his personality. One can go on the kind of high path of the good, and the other can go on the low path of the evil. And that's the whole point of the experiment. So I think it's so important to know that before we actually start studying the novel. So before we go into chapter 1, I'm just going to introduce a few key terms that are important to know before reading the novel. So I'll see you shortly. So firstly, before going into chapter 1, I'm going to discuss the allegorical nature of the novel. So I'll give you some time to read what's on the screen. Okay, so the joy, I suppose, of reading Jekyll and Hyde, and what I think is fascinating about this novel is Stevenson's use of allegories. This is the idea of the story having a symbolic hidden meaning. That means every plot event, every character, every setting, in a sense, has a symbolic meaning, has a deeper meaning that we can explore and make interpretations about. So when reading it, it's very important to not take things at face value. There is a more complex set of ideas contained in the story than what first meets the eye. So an example would be Hyde trampling on the little girl in chapter 1. Don't read that as a face value event. That has a symbolic meaning that we're going to explore and scratch away at. So really important to remember that there's a hidden meaning in this story. And on your screen you have the image of the transformation of Jekyll into Hyde. In fact, in this sense, it's Hyde into Jekyll. And what's really important throughout the novel and throughout our discussion of the novel is that you remember that this is an allegory, and you have to make your interpretations and come up with your own opinions, in a sense, about what this transformation represents. Does it, for example, represent the criminal within every Victorian gentleman? Is that the secret meaning of the story? Is it about how every Victorian gentleman has a repressed kind of sexual deviant within them? Is it alternatively, and lots of my former students have had this or have favoured this interpretation, is it alternatively about addiction? Is it about someone who becomes addicted to a substance and can't control their inner addict? Or is it about the more obvious, I suppose, meaning, which is good and evil, the battle between good and evil that rages within each of us? So it's really important that there are so many interpretations that we'll discuss throughout the novel, but remember that this act of transformation and this experiment that Jekyll performs in splitting his personality in two is absolutely allegorical, and we have to remember that there are multiple interpretations that can be made about that experiment and its results. The second core idea that needs to be introduced before reading this novel is on your screen. It's duality, and I'll give you some time to read the definition of dualism. Okay, and we have to remember that in this novel, again, just as I said that everything has a deeper meaning and a deeper symbolic meaning, we also have to remember that most of the characters have a dual nature. Even the characters who are ostensibly good characters, who are moral characters, seem to live a second secret double life, particularly in relation to the Victorian gentlemen that appear in the novel. So it's always worth remembering that at the absolute core of this novel is the theme of duality. It is one of the most crucial themes. In fact, it is the most crucial theme in the entire novel. How Stevenson's proposing in this novel that mankind is made up of both good and evil, and that we're not these perfect creatures who are always morally good, that we have evil within us. It's a very, very important theme. We've talked a lot in this unit so far about how this novel belongs to the Gothic genre and the fin de siècle genre. So this is a novel that explores horror themes of horror, but it also explores the anxieties that were felt by Victorians towards the end of the century. So that's what it means by fin de siècle. So fin de siècle novels typically express an anxiety about the way in which the direction in which Victorian society is heading. But it's also worth discussing the inclusion of the detective fiction genre that also, I think, is a genre that this novel belongs to. This is a novel in which I would argue that the main character, or one of the main characters, Gabriel Utterson, acts as a detective in which he's solving a mystery, the mystery of what's happened to his friend Henry Jekyll, why his friend Henry Jekyll has left all his worldly possessions to a certain Mr Hyde. So at the centre of this novel is the last will and testament of Henry Jekyll. It plays a huge part and a huge role in the novel. It's essentially a large clue to the reader, but it's also, I guess, it's a trigger. It causes, it's a plot device that causes action to happen. It causes characters to investigate what's happened to Jekyll in his life. So you have in this novel lots of documentation. You have the last will and testament of Henry Jekyll. You have the letters, one from Dr. Lanyon, one from Jekyll at the end. You have statements. You have a check in chapter 1. So there's essentially what we would call a paper trail that runs throughout the novel, a series of clues that essentially are really for the first time reader. And remember, the first time reader would not be aware that these two characters are the same person. They would think that they are two separate characters. And it's crucial to point out, and I'll point out again and again and again, that for a first time reader, you're supposed to think that Jekyll is being blackmailed by Hyde. And we're supposed to be working out what Hyde knows about Jekyll that he's blackmailing him about. So hugely important that we consider the fact that this novel also belongs to the detective genre because of the use of a kind of a detective in the character of Lanyon, because of the paper trail that's throughout the novel, and because at the heart of the novel lies that mystery being what has happened to Henry Jekyll. Why has he left his worldly goods to Mr. Hyde? What's their relationship? And of course, I've ruined the novel for you, but a first-time reader would not be aware that they are the same person. Okay, before we read chapter 1, you have a summary of the chapter coming up on your screens now, so I'll give you some time to read it and you won't hear my voice for a few seconds. So chapter 1, in terms of the framing of chapter 1, it's actually the story of the door is actually a story that's told by Enfield. He's quite a minor character. He is a friend and distant kinsman of Mr. Utterson. And Enfield tells this story, this odd story about this door that is on your screens. And at the centre of this of the story is the character of Mr. Hyde, who goes into the door and comes out with a cheque signed by Henry Jekyll, a cheque for £100, which is a hugely important moment in the novel and one of the many examples of a paper trail used as a clue for the reader. And we find out later in the novel that this door is actually the back door to Dr. Jekyll's house, and we'll talk about the significance of the door in more detail in this chapter as well. But at the heart of this story, the story of the door, is the introduction of I would call it almost the red herring, which is a term that is used to almost like a false clue that is given to us by Stevenson. And the red herring is that Jekyll and Hyde are in some sort of relationship. They have some sort of intimate relationship with one another, and that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll. That's what the reader is supposed to think, in my opinion, by the end of this chapter. That Jekyll has become the victim of blackmail for something he must have done in his past. So that's the story of the door, and we'll talk in more detail about. There's far more details to discuss as we go through this chapter. What we're going to discuss first, however, is the introduction to chapter 1, the opening page, and the introduction to the character of Mr. Utterson. Okay, before we read the opening page, here's an introduction to Mr. Utterson. I'll give you some time to have a read. Okay, so chapter 1, the story of the door. What we'll do is I'll read through the chapter first, and then we're going to pause and consider the key moments in relation to the character of Mr. Utterson. So I'll raise this so you can see a bit more. Okay, let's start. Mr. Utterson the lawyer was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beckoned from his eye, something indeed which was never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. He had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirit involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. I inclined to Cain's heresy, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, as long they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanour. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at the best, and even his friendships seemed to be founded in a similar catholicity of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy with the growth of time, they implied no aptness in the object. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who had encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business that they might enjoy them uninterrupted. Okay, time for a checkpoint. I would like you to have another read of that opening page, and then you have 3 questions I'd like you to respond to. Please make sure you're responding in full sentences. I would say take at least 10 to 15 minutes to complete this task. So please pause the video, and I'll see you shortly. Okay, so we're going to go through this section and focus on what the reader learns about Utterson and what information Stevenson gives to us, and our impressions of Utterson as a character so far. There is, he plays a significant role in this novel, and it's really important to understand how he's presented by Stevenson. Firstly, we've got this idea just immediately of his profession being quite important. So just like the other male characters in the novel, and I'll put the term gender politics because this is a very masculine novel, a novel that really does centre around masculinity and male friendships. Because all of our key characters are men; they're all Victorian gentlemen. Mr. Utterson being one. We also have Lanyon, we have Enfield, and we have obviously Jekyll himself. So the fact that he's a Mr. Utterson, he's a lawyer, the idea that he's of the professional classes, presumably upper middle class, and his profession, I would argue, reveals something about him as a character more or less immediately, and that is this idea of him being a rational character, someone who can weigh up evidence, who can solve riddles, solve problems. So the fact that he's a lawyer is significant because he is capable of finding the right evidence, he's capable of weighing up evidence, he's capable of cross-examining people if he needs to. So I think he has the right kind of rational and logical mind to be the detective in this novel. And I've said before that I think really Utterson plays the role of a detective in our mystery novel. He's the one who's going to work out what has become of his friend Dr. Henry Jekyll and why Henry Jekyll has left his worldly goods and all of his possessions to Mr. Hyde. So that's the first thing I would say about Utterson and what we learn about him just from that profession. The second thing, I think, the whole opening sentence, and it is a long opening sentence, it really hinges on this conjunction, yet. And what Stevenson does here, I think, is introduce the theme of duality immediately in this novel, which is obviously very much about the two-sidedness. The whole kind of conceit of the entire novel is about good and evil. It's about the double face and double life that Victorian gentlemen would lead. And the opening sentence is really surprising because of that yet, because Mr. Utterson is described as being lovable. So that adjective is, hopefully you notice, is completely contradictory given all the negative adjectives that are used before the yet, which kind of flips the whole thing on its head. So let's have a look at how he's described. He's got a rugged countenance, which implies that he's not particularly handsome, or if he is, he's kind of wild looking. It's never lighted by a smile. So we get the impression that he's a miserable character, someone who is quite stoical, someone who is quite cold. That is the next adjective. Look at the next list of them: cold, scanty, embarrassed in discourse. So he's an introvert. He's someone who doesn't. He's someone who, when they speak, is kind of self-conscious. I'll put introverts up. We've got this idea that he's not very emotionally available. He's cold. So in a sense, straight away we're introduced to what I would call a stereotypical image of your Victorian gentleman being a stiff upper lip kind of character, someone who represses their emotions, who is a man of few words, who doesn't show emotion. I think it's part of the again, going back to this point here, part of the gender politics here, this idea that he is another repressed male figure from the upper classes. The description gets even more, I suppose, negative. He's backwards in sentiment, so he's kind of old-fashioned and traditional. He's lean, long, dusty, and dreary. And what a list of adjectives from Stevenson here. None of these are particularly fond. They're not descriptions that are very positive. Particularly the last two, dusty and dreary, and that alliterative, dusty, dreary. This idea that he's this old-fashioned, stuffy, boring, miserable character, and then somehow lovable. And I suppose the question that I would ask as a first-time reader is, what exactly does make him lovable? He's not good-looking, so it's not his physical appearance. It's not the fact he's a good listener. He's very emotional. He's cold. He seems to be someone who you would run away from, not want to spend time with. So the inclusion of that yet somehow lovable completely flips the description on its head, and introduces this key theme of duality, of this idea of man having two sides, black and white, that kind of thing. That he has, it's a part of him that's somehow lovable. We don't know what it is yet. Okay. So the descriptions actually get more negative, not positive, I'm afraid, for Utterson. And I'm not going to get too much detail here, but he's described as having, something human beacons in his eye, but not in his speech. So he speaks kind of robotically or like an automata. But what Stevenson then goes on to say is that his actions speak loudly in the acts of his life. And we learn in this section something of Utterson's private life. And it's, again, a life, I would say, riddled with contradictions, just like the opening sentences. And contradictions go, linked to this theme of doubleness and duality, which is so crucial to our understanding of this novel. We know that he's austere, so he's quite strict with himself. He's very self-disciplined. Again, arguably typical of a Victorian gentleman, that he seems, again, to be repressed. He's someone who does not allow themselves. He's certainly not hedonistic. He's not someone who pursues pleasures. He's someone who's strict with himself, who's self-disciplined. And we get this impression, again, of this kind of almost cliched Victorian gentleman figure. He drinks gin when he's alone to mortify a taste for vintages. So he drinks it not because he enjoys the taste or because he enjoys gin, but because he wants to become more... he wants to become someone who is a bit of a connoisseur of gin. So he's doing it not out of... enjoyment, and certainly not for pleasure, but for intellectual curiosity. So again, reiterating this idea of him being somewhat repressed and somewhat dusty. Just as a kind of caveat and a bit of a tangent, lots of the characters are often seen in isolated positions. So you'll notice that Utterson, is described as drinking on his own. Later on, Henry Jekyll sits by the fire on his own. Lanyon greets Hyde when he's been, on his own in his house. There's lots of moments where these characters are clearly very solitary and isolated, despite the fact they have these male friendships. These friendships, as we'll go on to talk about with Enfield and Utterson, these friendships don't provide them with the sense of belonging, the sense of the sense of warmth that necessarily is needed from a friendship. And we'll look at that in more detail later on. The next section, which I think is crucial, again in Utterson and his description, is when Stevenson reveals some of his hobbies and some of his interests. So we know that he's interested in gin, but it's because not out of pleasure, but out of kind of intellectual curiosity, part of his self-discipline. The second thing we learn is he enjoyed the theatre, but had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. And I always point this out to my students as being another example of this, of duality. Because again, how can someone profess to love the theatre? How can that be one of your one of your hobbies, one of your interests, if you haven't crossed the door of one for 20 years? It seems to be contradictory. And perhaps this is about, Stevenson suggesting this is what Utterson tells other people about his identity. So far, I think it certainly does introduce this concept of identity in the novel, and how the identity of these characters is slippery. It's not fixed. It's hard, I think, so far to pin down Utterson. He seems to be a slippery character, hard to define. But how he can claim to love the theatre when he hasn't crossed one for 20 years is beyond me. Then we do learn about the positives of Utterson, and we learn why he's such a dear friend to Lanyon and to Jekyll. Lanyon will be introduced to later on. Henry Jekyll is obviously the most important character in the novel. He is the great mad scientist. And we learn here why is this man a great friend? Why is he lovable? And we get some indication about that now. And it's about this word here, tolerance. So Stevenson suggests that Utterson is someone who is not judgmental, and I think that goes back to him being a lawyer. He doesn't judge hastily. He builds up a picture of someone, and he clearly seems to be envious of those people who do experience high pressures of spirit. So I think this hints at this idea that he's somewhat envious of those people who are able to kind of, I suppose, unleash their inner desires. Unlike Utterson, who's very strict with himself, who doesn't have very high pressures of spirits, he's envious of those who do, in a sense. He's kind of, it hints here that he has a certain sympathy for criminal types and for people who are not as repressed as he is. That's what's being hinted at. So he doesn't, when he is involved in misdeeds, which is obviously because of his job and because of his role, he will be. He tends to be tolerant. He doesn't form judgments, and obviously, being non-judgmental will be a crucial trait in a friend, right? If you're ever in a situation where you need advice from a friend, you would want them to be non-judgmental. So Utterson is clearly someone who's a good listener, or someone who will listen without judging, which is, I would argue, clearly why he's considered such a valuable friend to have. We then learn that he's got an inclination to help rather than to reprove. So again, this reinforces the idea we spoke about just a minute ago. He's more interested in helping his friends who are in need, who may have been criminal, who may have committed criminal acts. He's more interested in helping than in kind of chastising or punishing or judging. So I think this has come up a couple of times now, this idea of the non-judgmental figure. We then hear Utterson's voice for the first time, and it's a figure of speech that he uses clearly at dinner parties, quite frequently. He says, "I incline to Cain's heresy." He used to say quaintly, "I let my brother go to the devil in his own way." And I'm going to explain that quotation and that allusion to the Bible with an image. So the allusion here is to the biblical story in the book of Genesis of Cain and Abel. Cain is the first murderer in the Bible, and he kills his brother Abel. And when asked, and God notices that Abel's missing, and God asks Cain, "Where is Abel?" And Cain famously responds, "Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he is." And students often get confused by this allusion, this reference to the Bible. What I would argue Utterson means by this, when he says, "I incline to Cain's heresy, I let my brother go to the devil in his own way," is not that he doesn't mean I incline to Cain's heresy of murder. He doesn't mean that. What he means is that he doesn't believe in the idea that every man ought to treat every other man as his brother. He doesn't believe in the fact that everyone has responsibility for everyone else. I think what he means when he says, "I incline to Cain's heresy, I let my brother go to the devil in his own way," is that he allows people to make their own choices and he doesn't interfere in that sense. I would have to say, I think there's another reason as to why Stevenson refers to these characters, these brothers from the Genesis story. Firstly, Cain and Abel are embodiments of, in a sense, good and evil, in a very similar way to Jekyll and Hyde. So it could be a very subtle example of foreshadowing, the central characters of the novel, Jekyll and Hyde, and good and evil. However, obviously in the story, Cain, the evil brother, is the one who murders the good brother Abel, and in Jekyll and Hyde, it's the opposite way round. Jekyll is the one who will have to kill Cain, the evil twin, as it were. So that's another kind of possible meaning of the reference to Cain and Abel and that story. Lastly, in terms of why this allusion might be significant, is once Cain, owns up to murdering his brother, God actually essentially protects him from being killed by others. He places what's called a mark on him, and we use this phrase, the mark of Cain. It's actually a protective mark. It's now affiliated kind of with the devil, etc. But in the story, it means that he's protected from being killed by others. And this mark, I think, is again another slight example of, a subtle example of foreshadowing, in that, of course, Hyde would be the one who is marked in this novel. He has this physical deformity that is often referred to, and perhaps it is the mark of Cain that Hyde has on him. And finally, at the end of this paragraph, we learn that Utterson is the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. So he's essentially the last good friend that these downgoing men will have. He's the last good influence that they might have. And again, this is a clear example of foreshadowing, because, of course, in this novel, Utterson will be the friend to two downgoing men, two men whose lives are going in this direction. One is Henry Jekyll, of course, who is the Promethean figure in this novel, the man who, or the Faustian figure, the man who is the embodiment of a man who's made a decision to acquire forbidden knowledge, and he'll be punished for that, playing God, as it were. And secondly, the other man, so that's Jekyll, who's going down, The other man, who's a downgoing man, is Lanyon, who later dies. He dies of shock. So it's again another example of foreshadowing the role that Utterson will play in the the downgoing men in the novel. We know will be Jekyll and Utterson. So that's the initial description of Utterson. We're going to take a checkpoint now. Okay, your questions are on the screen now. Timings are on the screen as well, so I'll see you shortly. Welcome back. We next learn about Utterson's friendships, and I'm not going to close read everything here. I'm just going to focus on a few quotations in turn. We know that he has a friendly circle, and I spoke earlier about the gender politics of this novel, how it is a novel that is dominated by these upper class single bachelors, these Victorian gentlemen who are unmarried. I often read this novel as being a fairly thinly veiled allegory for homosexuality in the Victorian period. And I think it's not a coincidence that all of our characters are single male bachelors. And I think that's the first thing to talk about. The fact that they're a friendly circle of men, upper middle class men, is interesting. We then learn about who his friends are, and we learn about the roots of his friendships. And this description is really interesting. Stevenson writes, his friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy with the growth of time, they implied no aptness in the object. So it's interesting that he seems to be a man of very few friends, Utterson. A close-knit group of friends is what he has, and they're usually people who he might even be related to. So this idea he doesn't have a very wide social circle. And you'd think that the fact that his friends are those of his own blood would mean that he has a very close and meaningful friendship with these people, but it doesn't seem to be the case, and we'll talk about that in a second. We learn that his friends are those he's known the longest, so it's not the case that he's shared lots of memories with his friends, or he's had lots of adventures with his friends, or he's had lots of incredibly important and profound conversations with his friends. He's just known them for a long time. And we have this great comparison. I'll use an image to explain it. So there's this great simile of comparing the affections of Utterson to ivy. So it's written, his affections like ivy with the growth of time. So you get this impression that he simply allows his friendships to carry on and grow. And if you think about how ivy grows, it kind of grows uncontrollably. It grows, and it grows over time and covers buildings, covers walls. So this idea that it has no control. It suggests that Utterson just allows things to happen. He's not someone who forges friendships. He's not someone who, he's not someone who falls out with his friends. They just steadily grow over the years in the same way that ivy grows. And finally, Stevenson introduces us to Utterson's best friend, I suppose, Mr. Enfield, who's also described as being a distant kinsman, so a distant relative. And he's a well-known man about town, but we don't know why he's a well-known man about town. It's kind of mysterious about who he is or why he's well-known. But again, Stevenson reinforces this theme of duality, which has been referred to numerous times now in the opening page. He describes the fact that they go on a regular Sunday walk, and the Sunday walk is what will trigger the story of the door. But then the odd thing about the walk, which is described as being the chief jewel of each week, so the metaphor of the idea that it's their treasured, the most treasured thing about their weeks is this walk that they go on each Sunday. But then there's this kind of doubleness to this walk. There's a two-sidedness to it, because they seem to both held it as being the most important thing in their week, but at the same time, when they're seen on walks by other people, they apparently don't say anything. So the quote is, they said nothing, and they both look singularly dull. So there's this idea that they seem to be characters who are extremely, shaped by habits and by tradition. They seem to be men of routine who have certain traits, certain habits, certain routines that they like to follow through, despite the fact there doesn't seem to be much basis to this friendship. They don't have anything to talk about, they don't seem to have anything in common, and when they see another person who they do know, they hail with obvious relief the appearance of that friend. So clearly they're not even enjoying themselves on this walk. So again, I hope I've reiterated this enough. There's this dual nature already to our characters, and particularly to the character of Utterson. And in the next lesson, we'll talk about the Sunday walk that's most pertinent to this chapter, the one which triggers the story of the door. So I'll see you next time for the next lesson, when we'll look at the description of this door and its significance to the wider novel. Stay safe and stay well, and I'll see you next time.